now listening to Radio Merdog.
What's up, and welcome to Radio Merdog, the show where we discuss everything related to cryptids, conspiracies, and chaos. I'm here to give you the lowdown on all kinds of craziness happening out there in the world, whether you want to believe it or not. There is a lot more to the world than what meets the eye, and if you broaden your horizons, you'll be surprised what is really out there, both in the sort of physical and metaphysical sense, in my opinion. And one of my favorite things is cryptids, and I've been studying cryptids as a pretty avid cryptozoologist for well over a decade now. And I've had the privilege to talk with lots of people all over the country about their personal experiences with these pretty awesome, sick creatures. And you might be wondering, what is a cryptid? And if you're wondering that, I'm glad you asked. Cryptozoology refers to the study of cryptids, which derives from the Greek word kryptos, which means hidden. So cryptozoology pretty much just refers to the study of quote-unquote hidden animals. So animals that aren't really fully recognized by science necessarily, but have generally a pretty well-documented history of sightings throughout history. And there are literally thousands of different cryptids out there in the world, in folklore, in legend, in myth, and I can guarantee that you know of at least a few, because it really includes everything from Bigfoot to the Mothman to really even like coelacanths and mountain gorillas were technically considered to be cryptids at one point. So it's a bit of a catch-22 when you're talking about them, because if a cryptid is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be 100% true and verified in the eyes of the scientific community, and is like fully living in this dimension with us, not in some extraterrestrial astral plane or anything wild like that, it's no longer technically a cryptid because it's not hidden anymore. But, you just call it a former cryptid or whatever. So this is where things like giant squids, mountain gorillas, and coelacanths fall into it. I mean, like, giant squids, the Kraken, they've been talked about for hundreds and thousands of years. I mean, they've been on ancient pirate maps forever, and they're kind of a representative of, like, man's ideas of the deep ocean and what lies in the great beyond, and just kind of, it's a pretty cool amalgamation of people's collective unconscious of creating this massive beast, which had never been fully videoed and proven to be its own species until it's either 2005 or 2006. It's pretty wild how recent of a discovery it was. Same with the colossal squid, just a few years later, which is basically the same thing, but a little bit more brutal. But we'll talk about that later on. So today what I want to go over is one of the most well-known cryptids, and it has a pretty interesting history because it's one of the most modern ones, and that's the Chupacabra. And so I really want to look at the origins of one of the most controversial cryptids nowadays, because there's a lot of weird stuff with it in different versions. So first off, start with the basics. The word Chupacabra translates directly to goat sucker in Spanish, which it was some like Spanish or Mexican radio host or TV guy who came up with the name because of the initial reports, which we'll get into in a sec. But it was kind of a joke name at first that he came up with, and it stuck for like 3 decades. So here we are still now dealing with the Chupa, the goat sucker. It's pretty awesome. Yeah, so the name, the earliest reports of the Chupacabra, basically there was livestock found dead with pretty questionable and suspicious wounds. And the other big factor is that they were allegedly drained of blood. So the farmers that found them were like, yo, bro, there's no blood. What is going on here? So, yeah, I mean, the first reports were only in 1995 in Canonovas, Puerto Rico, where this woman described seeing it. She basically said she saw an alien. It was like a bipedal, 4 to 5 foot tall, hunched over, alien-like creature with spikes on its back, giant black protruding spikes with big glowing red eyes. And it is interesting as well. There was a movie that came out the same year, earlier in 1995, called Species, and the alien creature in that film is pretty much exactly what she had described. So, kind of an interesting thing there. But once again, getting ahead of myself now. And here's the other weird thing with the Chupacabra, is that there's two kind of camps of thought when it comes to what it is and what the descriptions are of it. So there's the Puerto Rican version, which I just described, the smaller, spiny, bipedal critter with giant red eyes and a pretty overtly reptilian appearance. And this is what initially blew up the Chupacabra into popularity in the modern kind of collective consciousness, and is what most people think of when they think of the Puerto Rican goat sucker. But relatively recently, in the last 15-ish years, so like halfway through its legacy, there kind of cropped up this whole like southwestern United States version, which eyewitnesses report claim to be basically, it's like a hairless dog-like creature with generally like funky bluish gray skin and big fangs. And it's mainly been seen in Texas and northern Mexico, but has been seen all over the Southwest in Arizona, New Mexico, basically in desert climates. So this whole dilemma of having two pretty radically different versions of what's supposedly the same livestock sucking creature has caused a pretty big schism in the cryptid community and is the subject of lots of debate, so I want to look into that a little bit today. So, now we're back in Puerto Rico. It's March 1995. There's this big old massive series of attacks on livestock. So, all these farmers, well, it started with just 8 sheep discovered dead. Each of them with 3 distinct puncture wounds in the chest area, and once again, allegedly, completely drained of blood. And a few months later in August, so like, what was that, 5 months later, an eyewitness named Madeline Dolentino provided the first widely publicized description of the entity, which was the one I'd said before, the bipedal alien, big red eyes, big spikes, green skin, all of that goodness. And that's what blew up the bipedal reptilian idea. And over a pretty short time frame, I believe it was just a handful of months, there were reportedly 150 farm animals killed in a similar manner, with the puncture wounds and the lack of blood. And pretty quickly, all of the reportings of this series of events, they just went ham and spread globally. And soon enough, it was a total phenomenon, and people all over the world were, aware of this weird thing happening in Puerto Rico. And we're like, what the hell is this? What is really the Chupacabra? Is it just some rogue agents going out there just murdering livestock and draining their blood for some reason and just leaving them like just some weird serial killer? Or like, it was a weird time to be a cryptozoologist. So fast forward a couple of years, in the early 2000s, a whole new wave of reports came out, and these were supposed Chupacabra sightings in the American Southwest, mainly Texas, like I had said before. And it was the same reports that were happening, livestock being drained of blood and left lifeless, and sightings began to crop up of not a bipedal alien creature, but a canid-like creature, so like a coyote without hair and large fangs, roaming the desert countryside. So, over the past few decades, and you can look it up, there have been dozens of videos claiming to show this Chupacabra. But if you watch them, usually you'll see it in the comments, but if you look up what a coyote or wild dog looks like with suffering from mange, it's it's pretty dead on to what are shown in these videos of supposed chupacabras. So I'm not trying to totally discredit that it's some other creature, but, you know, it's it's pretty interesting to look at if you look at critters with mange. Because what mange does is it causes them to look super disheveled and not like how they would look normally. I mean, their fur comes off, they get all, you know, they can barely eat, so they get all shriveled and wilted, and it's a horrible thing for an animal to go through. So it can totally understandably throw off onlookers and make them think it's something supernatural just creeping around the desert. So yeah, over the past 3 decades. I mean, it was 1995, and now we're in 2025. People have been trying to come up with a rational way to figure out the plausibility of its existence. I mean, when it first started in 95, farmers were generally just reporting mysterious killings of various livestock with 2 or 3 puncture wounds on the carcasses. And yeah, they were immediately associated, these quote-unquote chupacabra killings, with seemingly untouched animal carcasses other than the puncture wounds. And then, you know, there's a whole lack of blood thing, which is where it was said that they suck the blood out of the victim. So there we go. Goat sucker, chupacabra, bam. There we go. So after that stuff was happening in Puerto Rico, the reports slowly just disseminated out of the country. And it really just kind of crept around the Central and South America regions at first. You know, Mexico, Brazil, Chile, until eventually it hit the US. And then we got the coyote-like version. That's just looks like a dog with mange. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. But there's a lot of weird components to it all. So the main thing that stood out to me when I've been researching this is that the areas that receive these chupacabra killings, they tend to experience really frequent and extreme dry seasons. So, for example, in Puerto Rico in 1995 and in Mexico in 1996, which is when they were getting a lot of sightings and reports of the killings, both countries were experiencing or dealing with the aftermath of pretty brutal droughts that caused a lot of problems to the farmers and just general agriculture and just the life. I mean, if you're in rural Puerto Rico or Mexico, you're not necessarily having that great of a time generally. Then you got a dry season and it's no good. That's a rough place to be. I mean, I've lived in Mexico for a couple of months and traveled all over there, and I've never been to Puerto Rico, but even nowadays, 5-10 years ago when I've been in Mexico, it's they're still living pretty rurally out there, and it was definitely more so the case in 1995, or 96 in this case for Mexico. So these investigations that ended up being carried out in the two countries at that time, they noted the certain dramatic flair in the violence of the killings. And those pretty brutal environmental conditions, they could potentially provide an explanation for the killings. So, wild predators losing their usual prey to the drought. So, say there's Mexican wolves down there, and the wolves generally eat the deer, and then the deer don't have the agriculture to munch on. Deer are gonna die. So, what do the wolves go to? They go to those nice, juicy sheep the farmers have and munch them down. So, that's a possible explanation. And that same theory can be applied to a bunch of the other chupacabra attacks, that the dry weather had made a more competitive environment for the native predators. And, that's the case in all of the regions that were experiencing chupacabra attacks. So, that same theory also... that idea can explain the increased violence in the killings, because, when animals get hungry and desperate, and they know that if they don't find a meal, they're gonna die, they'll be driven to hunt in pretty brutal ways, and even move closer to civilization and be around people when they otherwise might not, because they know that they could be hunted by people, but if they're starving, they don't care. So they basically just get forced to hunt people's livestock. And yeah, not just the amount, but the viciousness of it all. There's no doubt that was increased during these dry seasons. I was reading this one piece of literature regarding the Chupacabra called Tracking the Chupacabra, The Vampire Bests in Fact, Fiction, and Folklore by Benjamin Radford, and I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book. And he really went over 10 significant reports of Chupacabra attacks, 7 of which had the carcass recovered and examined by medical professionals. And these autopsies concluded each time that the causes of death were various animal attacks. And they were able to find that out through looking at the animal DNA found on the bodies. And he goes more in depth into it all in the book. But basically, he was just explaining that it's not unusual for an animal carcass to be left uneaten, while only displaying the puncture wounds or minimal signs of attack. So, dead animals, DNA of predators was found on them, do with that info what you will. Probably the biggest discrediting factor for the Chupacabra's existence is how inconsistent the descriptions of the creature are, because depending on the sighting, it's been described as everything from literally just from having thick skin or fur or a giant tail or no tail to looking like a bat or a dog or having wings or looking like an alien, like that first report. And I mean, it's just a pretty discrediting feature when, there's these same killings, these same problems going on, dead animal, puncture wounds, drained of blood. But then when people supposedly see it, it looks different every time. It makes you think a little bit. So there's this is a pretty unfortunately common thing with cryptids, is that this is the phenomenon where people who they've heard of this in whatever cryptid you can substitute it in this case obviously the newly popular Chupacabra, they had the name fresh in their mind. They probably watched a news report on that, one of these pretty outlandish reports, and, they happen to see a strange looking animal, whether it's a dog with mange or something else, who knows? I was reading these comments online, and they were talking about how in the 90s, there had recently been a bunch of Mexican porcupines introduced into Puerto Rico, which I'd never heard of these before. You can look up Mexican porcupines. Sounds like they're pretty small, but they had been introduced to that area where these attacks were happening, and they have the capability to walk on their hind legs, and they have large red, hairless, almond-shaped patches around their eyes, which, you could easily mistake that as giant red alien eyes. And they have these big iridescent, yellowish green quills, which could easily look like spikes on, the back of an alien. And, when it's nighttime and it's dark and, you're probably in a rural area in the forest or the jungle or the desert, it's hard to really get the scale of things accurately. So if you see this weird little Mexican porcupine stand up, I'd probably think it was an alien for sure, and would carry with me the rest of my life. So that's just something to be aware of, how easy it is to see something and then, especially if you don't really fully see it and don't have a good chance and good light to look at it, you'll think it's something different. That's why eyewitness reports are pretty unreliable generally. So that leads to people resorting to making sense of whatever they encountered, even if it was just a totally normal animal in the woods, and they label it as this recently discovered monster instead of the more realistic example. I mean, the whole coyote or dog with mange thing is just a perfect example of this whole problem. So now we're here at this point in the year of our Lord 2025, and the main scientific counterpoints for the Chupacabra's existence are that it's simply mange-afflicted coyotes or dogs who, during dry seasons, will, potentially attack prey. The prey they would normally hunt it isn't around, so they go for livestock. And, a lot of these canids, they have pretty substantial front teeth, fangs, and it can lead to these circular puncture marks. And just generally, this whole phenomenon of the Chupacabra could just be misunderstood predation, because circular puncture marks can easily appear when scavengers begin feeding after an animal dies. And then you're like, all right, that can kind of explain that, cool. But then you get to the whole missing blood thing, which is insane to think about. An animal having all of their blood sucked, it doesn't seem reasonable. So there is pretty simple counterpoint to that, which is that when an animal dies, depending on how it was killed, the blood will just pool up internally, and it seems like there's no blood from the outside, literally just pooling up internally, and it's there, the blood's there, but it just doesn't seem as visible from the outside. So that also is another potential explanation for that. It's unfortunately, I like to dwell in the mystical generally. I like to think as outlandish as possible and have fun with entertaining ideas, but it really does just seem like chupacabras are, at least in the way they've been described, probably not on this planet with us. I will say, for kind of two fringe reports that I've heard. One was this comment, and it was just this comment on Reddit. You can probably find it. It was this guy talking about reports in Puerto Rico. Mind you, it was in 1948, and they were of basically, he was talking about a UFO crash, and then this creature came out, basically the same description as the initial Chupacabra, green, alien, spiked, bipedal, big red eye thing, and it kind of terrorized the countryside for a bit. So that was pretty interesting. I wasn't able to find any other information to back that, but it was cool to read. And then at one point, way back when I was younger, I was doing a thing on a military base down in the New Mexico area. And I was literally 7 or 8 years old, but was already very into cryptids at that point. And I don't remember what made it come up, but I was talking with these officers who were on base, and they were telling me about cryptids. And we were talking about the Chupacabra, and they were telling me how it definitely exists. And they think it has to do with there being so much nuclear waste and testing done with that in conjunction with all of the UFO stuff. So think Roswell and all that. And they were saying it's kind of a conjunction of that and this new creature kind of came about, and it's, kind of alluding to it being a government experiment or something the government captured from a UFO and then perhaps tested on, perhaps it escaped, perhaps they released it as a test. I don't know. They also, mind you, these guys could have just been messing with me. That's very possible. But they were legit guys. They had been doing this for 30, 40 plus years. And mind you, who knows? Because, they were exposed to a lot of nuclear radiation over the years. So who knows we know what that does to the mind and the body. And it's not necessarily good. So I'm sure that can lead to some crazy theories. But point being, that really kind of got me into the whole Chupacabra thing at an early age. So I just thought I'd bring that up. So yeah, now we're back here in the present. So, even despite all of these supposed scientific counterpoints and explanations and stuff, there are still a lot of people, so many ranches and locals in Mexico, Puerto Rico, in the U.S., southwest, they just insist they've seen something that doesn't match any known wildlife. That is really true for any rural area. If you talk with people, they will tell you stories, not necessarily of the Chupacabra, but of all kinds of craziness out there, woods, in the jungle, in the desert, in the mountains. I just love it. I love learning about all of that, all the folklore, all of the myths, all of the legends out there. I look forward to being able to talk about Bigfoot and all the different lake monsters and, all the niche weird cryptids out there. It gets pretty crazy, especially in Appalachia. Those mountains are hundreds of millions, older, literally the Appalachians are older than the dinosaurs, literally the Triassic period. And there's some pretty wild stuff out there, really. I mean, when you're out there, there's a lot of stuff that you just can't explain. So it's there's a lot of really cool stuff to learn about in this whole world. So point being, a lot of people still believe in the Chupacabra. I'm not certain if I do or don't necessarily, but a lot of the evidence leads to a lack of real evidence of there being something not even supernatural, just a cryptid, something that can't be explained. So the divide between the scientific analysis and really just the lived experience is one of the core tensions in this legend. And I mean, that's the case with many, many cryptids. So that's what I've got on the Chupacabra today. Appreciate you for staying on and listening. And I hope that you can check out the next episodes I'm working on. And if you like this, just give it a like, maybe tell a friend about it. And that's all for now. This is Merdog on Radio Merdog, and I'm out. Peace.